Hey guys, this is Mike. We're back looking at the Tac Con trigger again. We had 2 reviews with the Tac Con and we had multiple failures to fire. They were all light primer strikes. I sent the trigger back and the company sent me back a replacement trigger. So far I've put about 500 rounds through the replacement and have not had any failure to fires. So we're going to compare the Tac Con trigger again using the replacement trigger. We're going to compare it to a M16. And today, I've also got a brand new trigger. I ordered a Wilson Combat 3-gun trigger. And so we're going to put that in the mix today. I've never shot it, we'll see how it runs. And we'll compare it to the Tac Con, and we'll compare it to the rate of fire we see in a full automatic gun. At the end of the shooting session, we're going to go back to the shop, and I'm going to sit down, and we're going to have a discussion about the Tac Con trigger. We're going to look at the physics, the mechanics, and the mathematics behind the Tac Con trigger, and try to show you guys exactly what this trigger can and cannot do so that you'll have a realistic expectation before ordering that trigger, and making sure that if you do decide to order that trigger, that you'll know what it is that you're getting and what you can expect from the trigger. Our game plan today is to use the Colt M16. We've got the Tac Con trigger that we put into a Colt, and then I put the Wilson Combat trigger in a gun that I put together just this week. This gun is a composite. I've got a Mega upper, an SI Defense lower. I use the Voltor A5 buffer system in stock. And so I've just put this gun together and we put the trigger in it and we're going to see how it'll run. Now, today what we're going to do is I'm going to do just burst. Before we tried to do 2 or 3 shot burst, and then we tried to empty the magazine. Today I've got magazines with 5 rounds, magazines with 10 rounds, and magazines with 20 rounds. And I'm going to dump as fast as I can through each of these guns. We're also going to measure our shot times today, and we'll record those so we can compare specifics of what the interval times are between shots with each of these guns and each of these triggers. So we'll start with the Colt M16. And we'll rotate through. I'm going to do a 5-shot burst in each, a 10-shot burst in each, a 20-shot burst in each, and we'll record our split times. Okay, the first gun we're going to use for our comparison is the M16A1 in full auto. This is a 5-shot burst. Next is the Tac Con trigger, 5 shots. We'll time the splits on these. We've got a new trigger. This is the Wilson Combat 3-gun trigger. Same ammo, and we'll time our split times on this and see what we can get. We got 1.5 split times with the Tac Con, and let's see what we got. Okay, so we did a 5-shot burst. We got split times of 1.5 seconds with both the Tac Con and with the Wilson Combat 3-gun. We're going to move up to a 10-round burst and see if we can improve our split times, or at least maintain those split times. And once again, for comparison, we'll use the M16. So this is full auto, 10-round burst. Okay, now we're going to go to the Tac Con trigger, 10 rounds. We'll time it. Okay, that's 10 rounds. Our split time actually improved. Okay, now we're going to try our Wilson Combat, another 10-round burst. We'll reset our timer. All right, we'll go back to the Colt. This is a 20-round burst, full auto. We'll see what this sounds like, and then we'll measure our split times with the semi-automatics. 20-round burst. Okay, this is the Tac Con trigger. It's in the assisted reset mode, and we're going to time it. And then we're going to go to the Wilson Combat 3-gun trigger. We'll do a 20-round burst here. We'll reset our timer and see what we get. Okay, we got split times, 20 shot split time of 0.18 seconds. So with the Wilson we got 0.18, and we'll go back now to the shop and we'll discuss a little bit about the mechanics of how the Tac Con trigger works, and we'll see you back there. Okay, this is Mike and we're back in the shop now. What I'd like to do is a final overview of the Tac Con trigger system. I'd like to talk about 3 topics. One is just the company itself and their customer service. The second area we're going to cover is really diving into the mechanics and the physics, as well as the mathematics behind how this trigger works. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about realistic expectations about what this trigger can and cannot do. There's a lot of chatter going on the internet about this trigger system, and it's just amazing what people are saying, really without any true knowledge of the trigger system itself. People are talking about being a bump fire trigger and a full auto trigger, and all you have to do is squeeze the trigger and pull it back and hold it, and it'll keep running. And all of these things are just not true. And we really want to kind of clarify this so you'll have realistic expectations about what this trigger is before making that purchase. So hopefully if you decide that you want to make that purchase, you'll be more satisfied. So first we'll talk a little bit about the company. If you've seen any of my other videos on the Tac Con trigger, you know that the first video that I had, we had about 8 failure to fires out of about 800 rounds. I emailed the company about that, and the very same day they called me. We had a long conversation about what was going on with the trigger. They agreed that those kind of failure to fires were not acceptable. They offered either a full refund or a new trigger. I wanted to continue to experiment with the trigger, and so I opted for a new trigger. So the bottom line is the company's real, their customer service seems to be good. They responded, and I sent the trigger back, and in about 3 weeks I got the replacement trigger. So I think the company is good to go for their customer service. Now what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about the physics, the mechanics, and the mathematics involved in this trigger. So let's come in close and we're going to look at the trigger systems. If we're going to talk about the Tac Con trigger, to have a good basic knowledge of how a semi-automatic trigger works. And remember, the Tac Con trigger is in fact a semi-automatic trigger. It was signed off by the ATF, and there's good reason for that because it functions like a semi-automatic trigger. So we'll start with a basic mil-spec type of semi-automatic trigger and make sure that we understand the terms and what we're talking about. So what we have is the hammer, the trigger itself, and then the disconnector. And the disconnector is spring loaded. There's a spring underneath that keeps spring tension. You can see if I push this, okay, there's a little spring tension. So there's always an upward forward spring tension on the disconnector. And the way that a semi-automatic trigger works, you have the front sear. This is where the trigger engages the hammer, okay? And when you pull the trigger to fire the gun, what you're doing is relieving the junction between the trigger and this front sear on the hammer. And so when you pull the trigger and disconnect the trigger from the hammer spring is going to fall. The hammer spring is going to push the hammer forward, and it's going to hit the primer and ignite the round. And then, so the hammer's going to go forward. Once the gun fires and cycles, the bolt carrier is going to interact with the face of the hammer. And the part of the bolt carrier that interacts is this front ramp. Okay? So this front ramp is going to push. There's the firing pin. Okay? And so what happens back up here is the bolt carrier then drives the hammer back. You're pulling on the trigger, okay, because you've just relieved this connection here. And so the trigger is held down. The hammer comes back, and you can see where there's an interaction between the disconnector and this spur on the trigger. And so this is under spring tension, and so it's going to ride over it and catch it. You're still holding the trigger back with your trigger finger, okay? And so the gun cycles, the bolt carrier will cock the hammer and then come back. The hammer could fall if it wasn't for the disconnector and the sear. So you have to relieve the pressure on the trigger, and when you let the trigger go with your trigger finger, you can see as the disconnector releases the upper part of the hammer, the front of the trigger is engaging the sear, the front sear on the hammer. So as you release the disconnector, it engages the hammer. And you can hear this as you're operating the semi-automatic. So you have to completely release the trigger, and then you can pull and fire again. And so this disconnector is engaging every time, and the only way you can let this disconnector disengage is to relieve the pressure on the trigger, let the trigger go forward, and then it'll re-engage the front trigger notch. Okay? Now, so let's look at the Tac Con trigger. And we can do this. This is in the assist mode. This is in the standard semi-automatic mode. Now, I'm going to charge the gun. It's unloaded and empty. Okay? And it is in the regular semi-automatic mode. And I'm going to pull the trigger. Let's do it this way so you can see. I'm going to pull the trigger, and this is a very nice trigger. It's smooth, but it is a 4.5 pound trigger. So we're going to pull, and you can see there's not a lot of travel with the trigger. Very little movement. And this is in the semi-automatic mode, okay? Now I'm going to keep pressure on the trigger, just as if I had just fired it, and I'm going to hand cycle it, okay? And that would be what would happen if the gun was fired. But if I keep pressure on the trigger that I'm doing with my thumb, it's not going to fire again. I have to relieve it, okay? So now I'm going to release the trigger, and you'll hear the disconnector. Hear that? That was the disconnector popping. Okay. Now I completely release the trigger, and then if I pull the trigger again, the hammer will drop. So you could hear that disconnector. Okay. Now we're going to put it in the assisted mode. Okay. So now we've moved this back, and we're going to look at the mechanics inside in just a minute. But let's just look at the trigger again. Okay. Now there are two benefits that the company talks about when you put it in the assisted reset mode. One is that they say the trigger travel is reduced. Okay, so they actually shorten it even a little bit more. The second is this assisted reset action of the lever that interacts with the trigger. And we'll go over that in great detail here in just a minute. So let's just say we're going to cock it. It's in assisted reset mode, and I'm going to fire. So with my thumb, I'm going to pull, and you'll see it doesn't take a lot of travel. Okay. Looks about the same as in the semi mode. Okay, I'm keeping pressure on the trigger. All right, remember it's a 4.5 pound trigger, so it takes 4.5 pounds of pressure. Now pretend that I fired it and the gun's cycling, so I'm going to hand cycle it. Now look at the trigger, and it's pushing up. Okay, did you see that? Okay, when I cycle this gun, look at my thumb and the trigger, and it's moving up slightly. That is the interaction of the assisted reset. So it moves the trigger. Now, the issue is you have to release the pressure on that trigger. Or if I continue the cycle, I'm going to let the bolt carrier, see the trigger drops back because I'm pushing on it. Now, when that happens, Listen to what happens when I release the trigger. That was the disconnector engaging, okay? So the assisted reset moves the trigger forward so that the disconnector is off of the trigger and the trigger is ready to reset with the front sear on the hammer, okay? But what's happening is if you have pressure, continued pressure on the trigger, then you kind of overcome that advantage. And you still have to relieve the pressure and fire another fire. Now I'm going to take this upper off and we're going to look at the trigger itself and try to explain that again as we're looking at the trigger parts. Now, let's come in and see if you can see inside here. This is the semi-automatic mode, and that's the assisted reset mode, okay? Semi-automatic, assisted reset. So what happens is, when you put it in the assisted reset mode, this back lever is the additional part that they've engineered. And that back lever interacts with this flat part of the hammer. The front of the hammer interacts with the bolt carrier. Okay, so when it cycles, what's cocking this hammer is this beveled part of the bolt carrier as it cycles back and goes forward. Now, it's really important to remember that when this bolt carrier goes forward and is locked, it's stripped around, is chambered around, and it's locked the round into the chamber, that the hammer is not interplaying with the bolt carrier at that point. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. So we're going to put it in the semi-auto mode, and we're going to look at the hammer. Get straight. Okay. Okay. So what we're looking at is this is the disconnector. There's the lip of the disconnector, and there's the part of the hammer that it's going to interact with. Okay, right here. Okay, so that's the disconnector, just like in any semi-automatic trigger. The only addition is this lever back here, and we're going to see what it does. Now, it's in semi-automatic mode, so that lever has been drawn out of the way. Okay, when we put it in the assisted mode, the lever raises up in position to interact with the hammer. When it's not in the assisted mode, it drops down so it does not interact. So what we're going to do, you're going to see when the bolt carrier drives the hammer back, okay, then you have the disconnector interacting. No, you had it before, right? It helps if you know the parts. Okay. Right in here is the disconnector, right there, and there's the little lip on the hammer. And you can see that it's engaged. Now watch that closely, just like that. I've got pressure on the trigger. I have to release the trigger. And that's what you were hearing before when we had the upper receiver on. And until that is released, once that is released, then the front of the trigger engages the notch on the hammer. Okay, and we showed you that in the standard trigger. At that point, it's ready to shoot again. So if I pull the trigger, which I'm going to do with my thumb, and catch the hammer, it'll drop. Okay, now I have pressure on the trigger. The hammer cycles. I have pressure on the trigger, and there again, you can see where the disconnector has engaged, right there, the disconnector has engaged the notch in the hammer. Yes. And so I have to release it again and shoot. That's the standard semi-automatic mode. Now let's see what happens when we push this back, okay? And that lever has now gotten into a position where it's going to interact with this flattish angled part of the hammer, okay? So when this comes back, okay, that's going to come back and that's going to hit that lever. It's hitting it right there, all right? As it hits that lever, it's going to drive the trigger. Now, where my thumb is, no, you don't have to move it. Where my thumb is, you can see the trigger move forward. slightly. Okay? All right. Now, I'm still putting pressure on the trigger. Now let's look inside. So what do you see? Okay, you had it inside. You still see that the disconnector is engaged in that notch, just on the edge. Now I'm going to release the trigger, and you hear it, okay? Now the difference is there is, like they said before at the factory, there is a decrease in the trigger travel, okay? And when this disconnector is right on the edge of that lip when you have it in the assisted mode, but it still holds the hammer. And it will, as long as you've got pressure on the trigger down here, that disconnector is going to keep that hammer from striking the firing pin. Okay, you've got to re-engage that front sear. That is the definition of making this a semi-automatic trigger. So when I release the pressure on the trigger, okay, you got to stop moving. Okay, now it's engaged the front, and I can shoot again. Okay, so everybody sees that trigger comes back. Okay, now let's talk about some mathematics involved here. What's driving this hammer back is the bolt carrier. The bolt carrier cycles back, hits the lever, okay, forces the trigger. Look at the trigger. So it forces the trigger forward. You see a slight movement. That brings the disconnector, when it's in this position forward, the disconnector is not engaging the lever. I don't know if you can see that or not. Okay? So if you could relieve all of the pressure from the trigger at the point that the hammer is engaging the assist lever, then when the hammer is not under pressure from the bolt carrier group anymore, the disconnector is not engaged in that. So it cuts out that one step, and that's the assisted reset. Now the trigger is reset, and it's ready to just pull off of that front sear and drop the hammer. But it's important to remember, because there again, people have been talking on the internet, all you have to do is pull the trigger back and hold the trigger and it'll just run. Well, guess what? If you hold the trigger back, it's going to engage that disconnector, and you still have to relieve the pressure, let the disconnector disengage, then it's going to engage the sear notch and the hammer, and then you still have to pull the trigger with 4.5 pounds of force again. Okay, so if we talk about the math here, let's just talk a little bit and see what's going on. I hope I've shown you the parts of the trigger that are working so that you can understand how the assisted reset is supposed to work. It's very important to understand that when you pull that trigger and the round fires, the gun cycles and there's another round in the chamber in a carbine in about 65 thousandths of a second. Okay? So we're going to talk in a little while about split times and rates of fire. Every gun has its natural rate of fire. And an AR-15 carbine with a carbine gas system will cycle, if it's let run full auto, about 900 or 950 rounds a minute. And so if you look at the split times, that's talking about the gun going from a fire to a complete cycle, re-chambering another round, locking the bolt, and dropping the hammer and firing the next round in about 65 thousandths of a second. And remember, we talked about with the assisted reset mode, the bolt carrier is driving the hammer back, and then when the bolt carrier gets about halfway, if you're looking at the gun, I've kind of looked at this to try to see when it occurs, but if you're looking at the gun and it's going through its cycle, when the bolt carrier gets about halfway right here, of the ejection port, then if you look underneath, the hammer is starting to disconnect from the interplay with the bolt carrier group, and the hammer is going to be sitting here with nothing pushing on it. Okay? Now, this whole cycle takes about 65 thousandths of a second. So from the time that the hammer is pushed back and hits the little lever that does the assisted reset to the time that the bolt carrier is now not interacting with the hammer anymore is probably more like about 60 thousandths of a second. So it's important to understand that to fully appreciate the assisted reset function, you've got to pull with 4.5 pounds of force. Okay? So if you have it on assisted reset, I'm going to pull, and to fire this trigger, it takes 4.5 pounds of force. The hammer is going to then strike the firing pin, ignite the round, and the gun is going to cycle. When the gun cycles in 60 thousandths of a second, this is going to interact with the lever. The hammer will interact with the lever. It will force the trigger forward a tiny bit and move the disconnector away from that notch on the top part of the hammer. Okay? Now, if I'm still pulling on the trigger in 60 thousandths of a second after putting 4.5 pounds of pressure on the trigger, then when the bolt carrier goes back into battery, the hammer has no pressure on it and the disconnector re-engages. So basically at that point, it's just like firing from the semi-automatic mode, except there's a very, very short, small amount of shortening of the trigger travel associated with that third position. Okay? But at that point, I still have to relieve the trigger and then pull 4.5 pounds of force again to have the trigger fire. Now, I hope that makes sense. So basically, if you're going to realize the full benefit of this trigger, you would have to pull the trigger with 4.5 pounds. Within 60 thousandths of a second, you would have to release all of the pressure on the trigger and then immediately pull the trigger with 4.5 pounds of force again. And so the point of that is that's not as easy as you might think it is. 60 thousandths of a second is faster than the blink of an eye. You can't see motion at 60 thousandths of a second very well. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about reasonable expectations for this trigger. I've got a little cheat sheet. I've written down a lot of split times and rates of fire. I took my replacement trigger out. I put about 500 rounds through the replacement trigger. And I have to say I'm very pleased that we had no failure to fires. I believe that the first trigger had a hammer spring that was just a little bit too light to set off each and every one of the military rounds we fired. And I've got some split times, and I'd like to talk a little bit about these split times. The split times run anywhere from about a 0.13 to a 0.18, okay? But I could frequently get split times of 0.13 and 0.14 between rounds. And a split time of 0.13 or 0.14 is a rate of fire of about 460 rounds a minute to about 430 rounds a minute. And that's pretty fast, okay? We compared this trigger to other triggers out there that were specifically designed to shoot fast. And what we found is that those other triggers shoot fast like this trigger shoots fast. Okay, they don't have the assisted reset mode, but I have to think that if you're fully benefiting from the theory behind the assisted reset, you're going to have to relieve the pressure and fire again in an extremely rapid sequence. And I think that in that situation, you'd be seeing somebody shooting this trigger more like a bump fire or full auto rate of 800 or 850, 900 rounds a minute. I have not been able to accomplish this. And I have to say in my defense, if you look at the video from Jerry Michalik, Jerry is a very accomplished professional shooter. He holds multiple world records for speed shooting. He can shoot a revolver like a full auto, it sounds like. Jerry got one of these triggers. It was sent to him for a review, and he did a review video, and I would recommend that you look at that review video. He had a timer. He took the trigger out for the first time, and he did several bursts very rapidly. His split times were about 0.13 to 0.14. And so one point that I would like to make is that one of the fastest triggers in the United States is shooting this trigger at a rate of about 460 to 430 rounds a minute. Okay? And so that's what I was achieving. And I think that that's certainly something that most people will be able to achieve with this trigger. Whether you can achieve the 700, 800, 900 rounds a minute that you might see with a bump fire stock, or that certainly you'll see with a full auto gun, I'm not sure that physically that's possible. I would challenge you, if you feel like you're shooting the trigger fast, get a timer and check your time. Check your split times. I think we're shooting them pretty darn fast. My split times are about what Jerry Mitchell was getting with his experience, and so I think that it's certainly a smooth, fast trigger. But if you expect to put this trigger in your gun and pull the trigger back and just let her rip and get 800 rounds a minute, it's just not going to happen. So I think you really have to keep that in mind and have very reasonable expectations if you're going to buy this trigger. It's kind of neat that it has that third position. The third position does decrease the trigger travel and has that lever that in theory will assist in the reset. But if you're going to have the reset assist take effect, you got to get off that trigger in about 60 thousandths of a second. That's a real challenge. I hope you found this informative. This will probably be the last time I talk about the Tac Con trigger, unless I can get out there and rip this thing at a 700 or 800 rounds a minute. Then I might show another video of that. I think if you're expecting a rate of close to 500 rounds a minute, then that's very doable with this trigger, and I think you'll be satisfied. I think if you're expecting a $500 full auto look-alike, then you're probably going to be disappointed if you get this trigger. So thanks for watching. If you have any comments, please leave those comments on YouTube. If you have any questions, post those, and I'll try to answer all of your questions as soon as you can. If you like the video, please hit the like button. If you like what you're seeing with our videos, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can do that by hitting the subscribe button. Appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.